The patient is then prone with the neck in a neutral position. Ideally, if lying on a table, the nose should be in an opening on the table, or the patient's forehead could be slightly elevated with a pad. The upper extremities are resting freely alongside the body, and the lower extremities are freely resting on the table, extended, and the toes positioned just off the edge of the bed. The therapist instructs the patient as follows. First, move your arms up onto the table so that the elbows are in contact with the table, they are slightly bent, and the wrists are in line with the shoulders. Second, press the elbows into the table medially and caudally towards the belly button. The shoulder blades will begin to move caudally and slightly into abduction, therefore into a neutral position. During support, the cervical-thoracic junction automatically straightens. The muscles are working in a distal direction, meaning towards the support on the medial epicondyles. The cervical spine automatically achieves a centrated position, and the activity between the deep neck flexors and neck extensors becomes balanced. The therapist palpates the lumbar spinal prostheses and asks the patient to try to push the therapist's fingers towards the ceiling, thereby decreasing the lumbar lordosis and the anterior pelvic tilt. To achieve this, the abdominal muscles need to be activated and the intra-abdominal pressure increased. Only minimal activity of the gluteals and lower extremity muscles should be observed. Another facilitation that can help the patient obtain correct pelvic alignment involves palpation of the lower abdominal quadrant, in the groin area, about 1/3 medially from the ASIS. The patient is asked to push the abdominal wall against the therapist's fingers. The patient performs this maneuver by increasing their intra-abdominal pressure. If the patient is unable to change the position of the shoulder blades, we can initially work separately on one and then the other extremity using different techniques. For example, we can approximate the humerus with the scapula, we can also use distraction technique, in which the therapist lightly pulls on the medial condyle of the humerus along the axis of the humerus in a distal direction. Like approximation, this facilitates muscle activity. It is important to use only light force. In another scenario, the therapist grasps the lower angle of the shoulder blades and pushes the shoulder blades in a cranio-medial direction. The patient works against the therapist's resistance to facilitate the lower scapular stabilizers. The therapist can also guide the shoulder girdles away from a centrated position, for example by changing humeral rotation. The patient will resist this force and attempt to actively maintain proper positioning of the shoulder complex. It is important that the therapist uses light pressure sufficient to create a reaction, but not so forceful that the patient is unable to correct the position. If the patient can maintain the initial position, the position of the trunk, shoulder blades, spine, and the pelvis, we can add the following instructions. Lightly lift the head from the table as if I wanted to slip a sheet of paper under your forehead. None of the segments can deviate from the initial position. The patient lifts the head from the table without mid or upper cervical extension. The small range of extension should be distributed throughout the upper thoracic and lower cervical segments. Lift the head from the table and turn your head slightly left and right, about 30 degrees. The head should not laterally bend, flex, or extend. Muscle activity is being observed. During movement, the muscle contour of the neck should be smooth and round, without prominence of individual muscles and without upper cervical extension. The patient should breathe freely throughout the movement. In this position, the segmental mobility of the lower cervical and upper thoracic spine can be practiced. The patient is instructed to lift the head so that they can feel movement in a given segment. At the same time, the therapist is palpating the cervical thoracic segment and moves craniocaudally to provide the patient with some feedback. The patient should be able to breathe normally in this position and should breathe into the dorsolateral aspects of the abdomen equally as much as they breathe into the ventral portion. The patient regulates the intra-abdominal pressure without excessive activity of the superficial muscles, trunk extensors, trapezius, hamstrings, etc. To increase awareness of support, axial resistance to the head can also be used. The therapist applies slight pressure to the head in the axis of the spine, and the patient works against the therapist's resistance. Similarly, exercises can be performed in low kneeling with forearm support. The patient is in a quadruped position with the toes off the table. The patient shifts their body back and sits on the heels while the upper extremities are supported on the table with the elbow on the table and the forearm pointing slightly medially. The head is in line with the spine. The patient is instructed to push the elbows into the table simultaneously in a medial and caudal direction towards the belly button, causing the shoulder blades to move into a caudal and slightly adducted direction, bringing them into a neutral alignment. The therapist applies pressure in an axial direction. The cervical-thoracic junction automatically straightens, and the muscles work in a distal direction, meaning towards the support. The therapist applies slight pressure into the hand in the direction of the elbow and the shoulder girdle. This pressure applied at the periphery facilitates uprighting of the spine and uprighting of the clavicular joints. The head maintains an elongated position. If the spine strays into kyphosis, the patient is asked to move their entire trunk slightly forward. The pelvis is brought into a higher position where lumbar kyphosis can be more easily controlled. The therapist then applies an adequate axial pressure. The patient should be aware of the points of support and spinal straightening.